There is about 1,000 years between the end of the Western Roman Empire and the beginning of the Renaissance. And we generally talk about this period as the Middle Ages. It's sometimes called the Dark Ages or medieval times. No matter what we call it, it generally has negative connotations. And this is because the first consideration of this era was described by people who generally thought of this time as being sandwiched between two golden ages: the golden age of the Roman Empire, and then the age of the Renaissance. And so, in comparison to, say, the Roman Empire or the age of the Renaissance, in which naturalism and realism was prized over abstraction, stylization, and a didactic message, it was described as a time of ignorance, decline of culture, and barbarianism. This is not the popular viewpoint now, however. We can talk about this age as being one of great richness of culture, complexity, and innovation, and the time in which modern Europe was born. In terms of the periods that we'll be speaking of, and art historians love to divide time periods, we have the early medieval period, which is the 5th century to the early 11th century. And then we have the Romanesque period, which starts in the year 1000 and goes to about 1200. This is sort of easy to understand because it comes after a millennial moment in which popularly people thought we're expecting a great apocalypse. So it starts in the year 1000. And that's followed by the Gothic period, which is a long stylistic period that runs from about the mid-12th century to the 15th century. And the map I'm showing you here is of Western and Northern Europe. And you might be able to recognize places where we might expect modern borders, but those don't exist in the Middle Ages. Instead, we have different tribes that rule in different places. In the British Islands and in Ireland, we'll be looking at some major sites that reflect an Anglo-Saxon and Germanic influence, and then where you expect to see France and Germany, we'll be talking about the Carolingian Empire. And then we've already looked down in the south in Spain, where we have already the influence of Islamic rule. And in the north, where we'll start, there is generally a fusion of many different cultures, of Germanic cultures, Celtic cultures, and the remnants of a Roman culture. The tribes that were powerful at this time were Germanic, Franks, Visigoths, Orthogoths, Saxons, Nords, and Celts. And so we have a very eclectic mix of cultures and visual culture that represent not just the cultures that were here before the Romans, but also the vestiges of a Roman Empire that reached as far as Britain. One thing that did unify these various tribes and cultures was the presence of Christianity as it spread to Western and Northern Europe. And it was met with local visual cultures that tried to make sense of this new faith using recognizable imagery and styles to spread a new message and educate people in the stories of the New Testament. And so we do see some vestiges of Roman imagery. And for example, I'm showing you the Gospel of Lindisfarne here, in which we see this figure that's very flattened, very geometric, very stylized, but seems to be wearing this kind of toga with lots of drapery, and it's very linear. But again, we still see these kind of Roman figures. And that is coupled with something that we'll be talking about soon called animal interlacing, in which we see all of these kind of viney, uh, abstract geometric forms of sort of lines that are intertwining in almost a kind of carpet look. And this is a taste for this abstraction that predated Christianity and was put to use in the illustration and illumination of Bibles. The other the other structure that was in place that we see during this period is feudalism. And you perhaps have some background knowledge about the structures of feudalism, but essentially it was a political and economic structure in which clan ties and family ties allowed for a system in which there was a mutual dependence amongst landowners and the people who worked on the land. We also have a secular feudalism that is somewhat intertwined with the church system that entered this region, in which the feudal lords and nobles had a mutual support system with religious leaders. Lords defended the claims of the Pope, and in return, the Pope would validate their authority. And as time goes on, the church becomes an institution of learning and the major patron of the arts. And for example, when we're looking at these two pages that I just described, these are examples of illuminated manuscripts that would have been produced in monasteries that are kind of places of learning, but also places in which culture was produced. The church then becomes a major employer of artists and artisans. There is a great need during this period for art production. They need to build buildings in these new areas where Christianity has a stronghold. And these buildings need furnishings. They need altarpieces and pews and candlesticks and texts. And Christianity met themes and styles of local artists with different traditions than just the Roman Empire. At this point, I'll back up and give you a little history of the peoples that inhabited these islands before the Romans arrived. So the Celts were an ancient European people who lived in what is modern-day France, Ireland, and England. And the Romans arrived here around 55 BCE. And by 43 CE, this area is under Roman rule. And this means that the Romans are now instituting the administrative structure that they have put in place throughout the empire. Christianity starts to arrive in the 1st century after Christ. Fast forward a few hundred years and the Romans leave this area. They abandon the islands around 406, and this is because they left to help defend the Gauls against Germanic peoples down in the east and the south. This causes the economic structure of the islands to suffer because for so long they had structures that were based on Roman strongholds, Roman centers, and Roman leaders. As this structure started to crumble, the Romanized British leaders hired mercenary armies that mainly consisted of Germanic, Angles, and Saxons. These mercenaries brought their families and they started to settle in the northwestern parts of the islands. And they brought with them a Germanic culture. So by the early medieval period, around the 5th century, we see in this area a fusion of Roman, British, Celtic, and Germanic cultures that we call the Anglo-Saxon culture. The earliest evidence we have of the Anglo-Saxon culture is from an excavation in a place called Sutton Hoo, which is right here. This is in the northeastern side of the British Isles in a region called East Anglia. At Sutton Hoo, there was a huge burial ship that was excavated, and it was really some of the first evidence of a very sophisticated Anglo-Saxon culture that existed in this region as early as the 6th and 7th centuries. It is the time of the tale Beowulf that was written in the 7th century, which described Anglo-Saxons as warrior clans. And the main character of Beowulf was buried with a hoard of treasures. And this is what we see at Sutton Hoo. There was a man, theoretically the human remains of a very elite person, that was discovered in an area called Mound 1. And he was found in a ship with treasures. It was all we see is kind of the outline of the ship, because the ship itself and actually the remains of whoever was buried there are no longer extant. But was left behind were gold objects. And we see here a gold purse cover, a belt buckle, and a helmet that were all found within Sutton Hoo.